To understand the true genesis of Glenview Mansion, one must look toward the shifting horizon of the late 19th century, specifically the year 1881, when the landscape of what we now know as Rockville was a vast, undulating tapestry of fertile farmland and dense hardwood groves. The origins of this estate do not spring from a single architectural blueprint, but rather from the vision of an era when the American dream was manifesting in stone and mortar across the expanding suburbs of the Midwest. Before the current neoclassical masterpiece ever graced the hilltop, the land was defined by its relationship to the surrounding agricultural community, a place where the soil was rich, and the vistas of the Rock River Valley were as expansive as the ambitions of the men who sought to tame them. The narrative begins in earnest with the acquisition of several hundred acres by a group of investors and visionaries who saw the potential for more than just crops on this high ridge. They saw a sanctuary for the burgeoning elite of the industrial age. The climate of the region in those early years was one of unbridled optimism, as the railroad infrastructure connected the quiet fields of Illinois to the frantic energy of Chicago and beyond. In these foundational years, the property was known primarily for its natural beauty, a series of rolling glens and limestone outcroppings that would eventually give the mansion its name. The first structures on the site were far more modest than the grand residence we see today, consisting of functional farmsteads and summer cottages that served as a retreat from the heat and soot of the city. However, the true transformation of Glenview began when the property caught the eye of the wealthy Lyon family, who were looking for a site that could accommodate both a massive working farm and a social seat that would rival the great estates of the East Coast. During the transition into the 1890s, the groundwork was laid for an architectural marvel that would reflect the Gilded Age's obsession with European elegance filtered through a distinctly American lens of functionality. The construction of the initial foundations required an immense coordinated effort, drawing on the skills of local stonemasons who were experts in working with the native limestone that gave the region its distinct character. This period of early development was marked by the scent of freshly turned earth and the rhythmic sound of hammers as the estate began to take shape against the skyline. The Lyon family envisioned a home that was not merely a house, but a total environment where formal gardens would transition seamlessly into untamed woodland. To achieve this, they began a decades-long process of land contouring, shifting tons of soil to create the dramatic vistas that define the property to this day. This first part of our exploration into the history of Glenview Mansion focuses on the sheer physical labor and the environmental engineering that preceded the fine wood carvings and the marble fireplaces. It was an era when the dream of an estate was a battle against the elements, requiring a workforce of hundreds to clear the land, build the initial carriage roads, and plant the thousands of ornamental trees that would eventually grow into the majestic canopy we see now. The complexity of the task was immense, as every piece of building material that wasn't quarried on site had to be hauled by horse and wagon from the rail lines several miles away. As the turn of the century approached, the ambition for Glenview grew even larger, moving away from its origins as a quiet summer retreat and toward the idea of a permanent, year-round seat of power. The architects of this period were tasked with creating a structure that could withstand the fierce Illinois winters while maintaining an air of lightness and grace. They looked toward the classical traditions of Greece and Rome for inspiration, planning a facade of soaring columns and symmetrical wings that would command the attention of anyone approaching from the valley below. This foundational era was characterized by a sense of permanence. The men building Glenview were not interested in the fleeting trends of the day, but in creating a legacy that would endure for centuries. The interior spaces were designed with a grand scale in mind, featuring high ceilings and expansive hallways that were meant to be filled with the light of the Midwestern sun. While the primary residence was the focal point, The early development also included the construction of a massive stable complex and greenhouses that would allow the estate to remain self-sufficient throughout the year. The relationship between the house and the surrounding community of Rockville was one of mutual dependence, as the estate provided jobs for generations of local families, while the town provided the services and supplies needed to keep such a massive operation running. In these early years, the mansion was a symbol of the progress and the prosperity that defined the late Victorian era, a place where the industrial wealth of the nation was being translated into a landscape of refined beauty. The red clay and limestone of Illinois were being forged into something extraordinary, and the story of the people who lived and worked on this land was only just beginning to be written. The air was filled with the promise of a new century, and the hill above the Rock River was about to become the site of one of the most significant social and architectural experiments in the history of the region. The stones were being set, the gardens were being mapped, and the era of Glenview's great influence was about to dawn in a world that was rapidly moving toward the modern age. The vision was grand, the scale was unprecedented, and the foundations were deep enough to support the weight of a century of history that was yet to come. As the 1890s drew to a close, the silhouette of the mansion began to emerge from the scaffolding, a white stone sentinel that represented the pinnacle of Midwestern achievement. The story of Glenview was moving from its rural, agricultural beginnings into a period of high society elegance and political intrigue that would see it become the social heart of the state. Every brick laid and every tree planted during these foundational years was a testament to belief in the future, a belief that a masterpiece could be created out of the wild Illinois landscape if one had the resources and the patience to see it through. The narrative of the house was unfolding in the rhythmic cycles of the seasons, from the blooming of the first spring orchards to the quiet, snow-covered stillness of the winter ridge. The stage was set, the characters were moving into place, and the true glory of Glenview Mansion was waiting just over the horizon of the coming decade. As the final years of the 19th century gave way to the dawn of the 1900s, the skeleton of Glenview Mansion began to take on its finished form, transitioning from a chaotic construction site into a polished beacon of neoclassical splendor that dominated the Rockville skyline. This second part of our 16-part narrative focuses on the pivotal years of 1900 through 1910, an era defined by the meticulous interior outfitting of the residence and the official debut of the Leon family as the premier hosts of the Illinois interior. With the massive limestone exterior largely complete, the focus shifted to the highly specialized craftsmanship required to transform the cavernous rooms into intimate spaces of luxury and power. This was the period when the estate's true personality emerged, characterized by a staggering attention to detail that saw artisans from across the country arriving in Rockville to carve ornate mantels, lay intricate parquet floors, and install the latest in modern conveniences. The Leon family spared no expense, importing massive slabs of Carrara marble for the grand entrance hall and commissioning hand-painted murals that depicted pastoral scenes of the Midwest, effectively grounding the European architectural style in the local geography. To walk through the mansion during this decade was to witness the marriage of ancient aesthetics and modern engineering. While the soaring onyx columns suggested a connection to the classical past, the walls were secretly honeycombed with the most advanced electrical wiring and plumbing systems available at the time. This technological sophistication was a hallmark of the Leon vision, as they intended for Glenview to be a year-round seat of influence rather than a mere summer retreat. The second part of our story explores the logistical marvel of the kitchen and service wings, which were designed with a factory-like efficiency to support a social calendar that was becoming the talk of the state. The basement housed a massive coal-fired furnace and a dedicated laundry facility, while the upper floors were divided into sprawling guest suites, each with its own unique decorative theme. Outside, The landscaping reached a new level of maturity as the thousands of saplings planted a decade earlier began to form the lush, green corridors that would give the estate its name. The terrace gardens were expanded to include a formal rose garden and a reflection pool that mirrored the white stone facade, creating a sense of tranquility that contrasted with the industrial boom happening in nearby cities. This was also the era when the social hierarchy of Glenview became firmly established, with a permanent domestic staff of dozens who lived on the property, from the head butler who managed the silver to the team of gardeners who maintained the geometric precision of the lawns. The relationship between the mansion and the town of Rockville deepened during these years, as the Lyon family became major philanthropists, funding local libraries and parks, yet a distinct sense of mystery always surrounded the hilltop. The massive iron gates became a symbol of a world apart, a place where the rules of the ordinary world didn't seem to apply. As the 1910s approached, Glenview was no longer just a building project. It was a living, breathing entity that hosted governors, industrial titans, and international travelers, all of whom were struck by the sheer audacity of creating such a refined environment in the heart of the Illinois prairie. The second part of our saga concludes as the mansion prepared for the arrival of its first great period of political intrigue, as the Lyon family began to leverage their wealth and their home to influence the direction of the state's burgeoning economy. The limestone was white and unweathered, the gardens were in their first full bloom of maturity, and the lights of the grand ballroom could be seen for miles across the river valley, signaling that the age of Glenview had truly begun. The scent of expensive cigars and fine French perfumes filled the air of the drawing rooms, and the soft clinking of crystal became the soundtrack to evenings that lasted until the first light of dawn. However, beneath this veneer of perfect elegance, the first cracks in the family's unity were beginning to show, and the looming shadow of the First World War was starting to appear on the distant horizon, threatening to change the social fabric of the country forever. The story of Glenview was moving from the triumph of its construction into the complexities of its survival, and the bricks and mortar were about to be tested by the weight of a world in transition. Every room held a secret, and every hallway whispered of the ambitions and the anxieties of those who called this limestone palace home. As the decade came to a close, Glenview stood as a finished masterpiece, a monument to the Gilded Age that was as fragile as it was formidable, waiting for the next chapter of its long and winding history to unfold in the changing light of a new American century. The arrival of the 1910s brought a sharpening of the social and political atmosphere surrounding Glenview Mansion, as the estate matured from a new architectural curiosity into a seasoned center of Midwestern power and influence. This third part of our 16-part exploration delves into the decade between 1910 and 1920, a period characterized by the juxtaposition of peak Gilded Age opulence against the sobering reality of a world moving toward global conflict. During these years, the Lyon family utilized the mansion as a strategic tool for diplomacy and economic expansion, hosting elaborate house parties that were often thinly veiled board meetings for the nation's most powerful industrial interests. The interior of the mansion, now fully seasoned, took on a deeper character. The once bright white Carrara marble began to absorb the history of the house, and the dark walnut paneling in the library grew richer under the glow of thousands of leather-bound volumes. This was the era of the great weekend retreats, where guests would arrive by private rail car at the Rockville station and be whisked away to the hilltop in a fleet of early automobiles, a technological shift that necessitated the conversion of the old carriage house into a modern garage facility. The social life of the mansion during this time was choreographed with a military-like precision by Mrs. Lyon, who saw herself as the arbiter of taste for the entire region, ensuring that every dinner service and every garden gala met the highest standards of international high society. However, the true drama of this decade lay in the mansion's response to the First World War, which fundamentally altered the rhythm of life on the estate. As the United States entered the conflict in 1917, the carefree celebrations in the ballroom were replaced by somber charitable events and strategic planning sessions, with the Lyon family dedicating significant portions of the estate's resources to the war effort. The third part of our narrative focuses on how the physical spaces of the house were repurposed during these lean years. The grand sunroom was often filled with local women sewing bandages and knitting supplies for soldiers, while the expansive basement became a storage hub for agricultural surplus destined for Europe. The workforce of the estate was also heavily impacted, as many of the young men who tended the gardens and maintained the stables departed for the front lines, leaving a skeletal crew to manage the hundreds of acres. This labor shortage led to a temporary softening of the estate's manicured perfection, with the formal lawns growing longer and the ornamental hedges losing their sharp geometric edges, a physical manifestation of a world out of balance. Despite these challenges, Glenview remained a symbol of stability for the community of Rockville, its limestone walls providing a sense of permanence in an era of terrifying change. The end of the war in 1918 brought a brief, explosive return to luxury, but it was a different kind of celebration than the pre-war years, tempered by a sense of loss and a growing awareness that the old world of the 19th century was gone forever. The mansion's architecture proved its resilience once again as it transitioned into the early Jazz age, with the formal dining rooms and parlors proving to be the perfect settings for the more relaxed, yet still high-stakes, social interactions of the new decade. This was also a period of generational shift within the Lyon family, as the children who had grown up in the halls of Glenview began to take on roles of leadership, bringing with them a more modern, less formal approach to estate management. The third part of our saga concludes as the 1920s approached, a decade that would bring both the highest peaks of the mansion's social fame and the first real whispers of the economic volatility that would later threaten its very existence. The air around the hilltop was thick with the scent of spring lilacs and the hum of a society that was eager to forget the horrors of the past and embrace a future of unlimited potential. The limestone sentinel of Glenview stood ready, its windows reflecting the changing light of a nation that was becoming a global superpower, and its halls prepared to absorb the music, the laughter, and the secrets of the most vibrant era the estate had ever seen. The legacy of the founders was secure for now, but the spirit of the house was evolving, moving away from the rigid structures of the Victorian past and toward the unpredictable energy of the modern age. Every stone remained in place, and every tree continued to reach toward the sky, but the hearts of those within the walls were beating to a new, faster rhythm, signaling that the story of Glenview was entering its most glamorous and dangerous chapter yet. The roaring 1920s arrived at Glenview Mansion like a sudden, electric surge of light, ushering in an era of unprecedented extravagance that would define the estate's reputation as the social epicenter of Illinois for a generation. This fourth part of our 16-part journey explores the decade when the mansion moved beyond mere prestige and into the realm of legend, as the post-war economic boom provided the Lyon family with the limitless capital necessary to push the boundaries of luxury. The quiet, stoic dignity of the early 1900s was replaced by a vibrant, restless energy that saw the ballroom floor polished to a mirror finish nearly every week to accommodate a revolving door of jazz bands and socialites. During these years, Glenview became a sanctuary for the elite who wished to escape the increasingly stringent eyes of city officials in Chicago, offering a private world where the champagne flowed despite the national prohibition laws. The fourth part of our story focuses on the secret architecture of this era, as the mansion was subtly modified to include hidden cellars and discreet storage areas that could vanish behind oak paneling at a moment's notice. These modifications were handled by the same families of craftsmen who had built the house, ensuring that the additions remained invisible to the uninitiated while providing the infrastructure for some of the most famous parties in Midwestern history. The gardens, too, underwent a radical transformation during the 20s, reflecting the Art Deco influences of the period. The soft, flowing lines of the Victorian era were tightened into sharp, geometric patterns, and the addition of an ornate, heated conservatory allowed for the cultivation of tropical orchids and citrus trees even in the depths of a Rockville blizzard. This was the era when Glenview truly became a self-sustaining island of privilege, with its own power plant, water filtration system, and an increasingly specialized staff that included a dedicated pastry chef and a master of the hunt. The social dynamics within the house were changing as well, as the younger generation of Lyon heirs brought a more casual, adventurous spirit to the estate, often arriving in open-top sports cars that roared up the winding driveway and shattered the morning silence of the river valley. However, the true legacy of the 1920s at Glenview lay in the intersection of high society and the blossoming world of cinema and radio. The mansion was often used as a backdrop for early film reels and was one of the first private residences in the state to install a high-fidelity radio room, connecting the limestone halls to the global culture of the Jazz Age. The fourth part of our narrative also examines the hidden costs of this brilliance, as the administrative burden of the estate became a massive corporate undertaking, requiring a team of accountants to manage the staggering payroll and the rising taxes of the booming decade. Despite the outward appearance of effortless grace, the internal machinery of the mansion was under constant strain, and the elder members of the Lyon family began to voice concerns about the sustainability of such an intense lifestyle. These years were a blur of midnight galas, garden tennis matches, and the constant hum of social ambition, with the mansion serving as a fortress against the changing world outside. The air of Rockville was thick with the scent of gasoline and expensive roses, and for a few fleeting years, it seemed as though the golden age of Glenview would never end. The limestone walls stood as a testament to the power of American industry and the dream of a permanent aristocracy, but the very wealth that had built the house was becoming increasingly detached from the reality of the land it sat upon. The story of the mansion was reaching its most glittering peak, a summit of light and music that could be seen for miles, but the shadows were beginning to grow long on the horizon of the 1930s. This chapter concludes as the estate reached the final, breathless months of 1929, with the ballroom lights burning brighter than ever before, unaware that the foundations of the global economy were about to tremble. The music was playing, the crystal was clinking, and the Lyon family stood at the center of a world that felt invincible, a white stone palace reflecting the last, long rays of a sun that was about to set on the age of excess. Every hallway was filled with the echoes of a decade that had redefined American luxury, and every room was a treasure chest of modern marvels and ancient ghosts, waiting for the silence that would inevitably follow the storm. The transition from the feverish energy of the 1920s into the somber reality of the 1930s brought a heavy, transformative silence to the limestone halls of Glenview Mansion, as the Great Depression began to reshape the social and economic landscape of the entire Midwest. This fifth part of our 16-part saga explores the era of the Great Cooling, a decade when the white stone sentinel of Rockville had to reconcile its history of limitless excess with the cold, hard realities of a nation in financial collapse. The stock market crash of 1929 had hit the Lyon family's industrial holdings with a devastating force, and almost overnight, the vibrant, non-stop rhythm of the estate began to slow to a cautious, measured beat. The first sign of the changing times was the disappearance of the massive, nightly social gatherings. The ballroom lights, which had once burned like a beacon across the river valley, were now extinguished more often than they were lit, and the grand chandeliers were shrouded in protective cloth to preserve their crystal from the dust of a quieter house. The fifth part of our story focuses on the resilience of the mansion as a physical structure during this period of forced austerity, as the family and their dwindling staff moved from a lifestyle of luxury into one of strategic survival. To save on heating costs, entire wings of the house were closed off, their heavy oak doors locked and their windows shuttered, leaving the family to inhabit only a small cluster of rooms in the central block. This consolidation turned the sprawling estate into a more intimate, albeit more somber domestic space, where the echoes of past laughter seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Despite the financial strain, the Lyon family felt a deep, ancestral obligation to maintain the integrity of the mansion, viewing it as a symbol of hope and stability for the town of Rockville, which was suffering even more acutely from the economic downturn. The maintenance of the limestone exterior became a point of pride. Even when there was no money for champagne or silk, the family ensured that the moss was cleared from the columns and the slate roof remained watertight. The fifth part of our narrative also details the shifting relationship between the mansion and its grounds, which returned to their productive, agricultural roots out of sheer necessity. The formal geometric flower beds were largely abandoned in favor of large vegetable gardens that could feed the family and the remaining servants, while the expansive orchards were harvested with a new intensity to provide fruit for the local community. The once manicured lawns saw the return of grazing livestock, a visual throwback to the 19th century farm that had existed before the limestone palace was built. This era was also a time of profound internal reflection for the Lyon heirs, who had to learn the practical skills of estate management that their parents had previously delegated to a fleet of professionals. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed from one of high-stakes social competition to one of quiet intellectualism and family unity. The library became the most used room in the mansion, its fireplace providing a central hearth for discussions about the New Deal and the future of American industry. This decade of silence allowed the architecture of Glenview to shine in a different light, stripped of the distractions of the Jazz Age, and revealed as a masterpiece of form and proportion that did not need a party to justify its existence. As the 1930s progressed, the mansion became a sanctuary for the family's collection of art and history, a repository for a world that seemed to be disappearing outside the gates. The fifth part of our journey concludes as the decade drew to a close and the first tremors of another global conflict began to be felt across the ocean. While the economic wounds of the Depression were slowly healing, the spirit of Glenview had been forever altered, moving away from the arrogant permanence of the Gilded Age toward a more humble and protective sense of stewardship. The limestone remained white, and the columns remained straight, but the people within the walls were more watchful and more appreciative of the shelter the mansion provided. The air of Rockville was no longer thick with the scent of gasoline and perfume, but was filled with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, signaling a return to the fundamentals of life on the Illinois prairie. The mansion stood ready for whatever the 1940s would bring, knowing now that its strength lay not in its wealth, but in its ability to adapt and endure through the darkest seasons of the human experience. The story of Glenview was no longer just about light and music. It was about the quiet, steady heartbeat of a house that had learned how to breathe in the silence. The 1940s dawned over the limestone ridges of Rockville, with a sense of urgent purpose that fundamentally shifted the identity of Glenview Mansion from a private sanctuary of the elite into a vital cog in the American war machine. This sixth part of our 16-part saga examines the era when the world's second great conflict demanded a total mobilization of resources, and the Lyon family responded by opening their gates to the needs of the federal government and the local community in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade prior. As the United States was drawn into the Second World War following the events of 1941, the mansion's sprawling acreage and robust infrastructure made it an ideal site for various domestic initiatives aimed at supporting the front lines. The sixth part of our story focuses on the physical transformation of the estate's peripheral buildings and the grounds themselves, which were partially converted into training areas for local civil defense units and victory gardens that spanned the once manicured lower terraces. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere of the 1930s quiet reflection was replaced by a bustling, utilitarian energy as Mrs. Leon and her daughters organized the Rockville chapter of the Red Cross, turning the grand ballroom, once the site of jazz-age decadence, into a massive production floor for surgical dressings and relief packages. The thick limestone walls, which had been built for prestige, now served as a literal fortress of security for sensitive planning meetings between regional industrial leaders and military logistical officers, who used the mansion's private offices to coordinate the massive output of the Illinois manufacturing belt. This period saw the final dissolution of the traditional servant and master dynamic that had defined the house since 1881, as nearly every able-bodied man and woman previously employed by the estate left to join the armed forces or take higher-paying jobs in the nearby munitions factories. The Leon family themselves took on the daily chores of maintaining the central block, a humbling and transformative experience that deepened their connection to the physical reality of the house. The sixth part of our narrative also details the architectural toll of the war years, as the lack of specialized materials and labor meant that non-essential repairs were deferred, leading to a slight weathering of the neoclassical facade that added a layer of rugged dignity to the structure. Despite the scarcity of the era, the mansion remained a beacon of morale for the town of Rockville. The family famously kept the exterior lights of the grand portico illuminated during the arrival of returning veterans, a gesture that cemented Glenview's status as the emotional heart of the community. As the war reached its conclusion in 1945, the mansion did not immediately return to its former state of luxury, but instead entered a period of profound transition. The world that emerged from the conflict was one of rapid suburbanization and a burgeoning middle class, and the site of a massive private estate on a hill began to look like a relic of a bygone social order. The sixth part of our journey concludes as the 1940s drew to a close, with the Leon family facing the reality that the post-war economy and the rising costs of land maintenance were making the traditional operation of Glenview increasingly difficult. The air of Rockville was no longer filled with the sounds of marching boots or the frantic typing of relief workers, but with the hum of a new, optimistic generation that was looking toward the future. The limestone walls stood tall, having survived the greatest global upheaval in history, but the internal spirit of the house was at a crossroads. The family began to discuss the long-term legacy of the estate, realizing that for Glenview to survive the coming decades, it would have to find a way to serve the public interest while preserving its historical integrity. The stage was set for the 1950s, a decade that would bring both the threat of development and the first seeds of a preservation movement that would eventually transform the mansion into the landmark we know today. The story was moving away from the era of private power and into the era of public memory, and the limestone sentinel of the Rock River Valley was prepared to watch over a world that was changing faster than ever before. Every room in the house now held the ghosts of soldiers and volunteers, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the weight of the sacrifices made within its walls. The golden age of the Gilded Age was a distant memory, replaced by a sense of civic duty that would define the next chapter of Glenview's long and winding path through American history. The 1950s arrived at the gates of Glenview Mansion, not with the fanfare of a new social season, but with the quiet, persistent pressure of a world that was rapidly outgrowing the sprawling estates of the previous century. This seventh part of our 16-part history explores a decade of profound existential crisis, as the Leon family faced the harsh reality that the era of the private country gentleman was being swept away by the rising tide of post-war suburbanization. The landscape surrounding Rockville was no longer a vast tapestry of isolated farms. Instead, the hills were being carved into neat grids of single-family homes, and the once distant sounds of the city were creeping closer to the mansion's limestone walls every day. During this period, the financial burden of maintaining the neoclassical masterpiece reached a breaking point, as the astronomical costs of heating the central block and repairing the intricate slate roof collided with a new, more aggressive tax code. The seventh part of our story focuses on the strategic retreat of the family within their own home, as they began to consider the unthinkable possibility of selling portions of the ancestral land to developers to fund the survival of the main house. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was one of refined preservation, with the family acting more as curators than residents, carefully documenting the provenance of the art and furniture that had occupied the rooms for half a century. This was the decade when the first serious discussions regarding the transition of Glenview into a public or institutional entity began to take place behind closed doors in the walnut-paneled library. The Lyon heirs, recognizing that the mansion was too significant to be allowed to decay, but too expensive to remain a private home, began to court various civic organizations and historical societies, seeking a partner who could guarantee the estate's future. The seventh part of our narrative also details the physical changes to the grounds during the 50s, which saw the formal gardens further simplified as the army of professional landscapers was replaced by a small, dedicated crew who focused on the essential health of the ancient oaks and the structural integrity of the stone terraces. Despite the mounting pressures, the mansion remained a site of architectural wonder, its white columns standing in sharp contrast to the prefabricated housing developments that were rising just beyond the property line. This era represented the birth of the preservationist spirit at Glenview, as the local community of Rockville began to realize that the mansion was not just a symbol of private wealth, but a vital piece of their collective identity that was now under threat. The family's role in the town shifted from that of distant patrons to that of embattled protectors, as they fought against zoning changes and infrastructure projects that threatened to bisect the estate with high-speed roadways. The struggle to maintain the Glenview view became a rallying cry for those who valued the aesthetic and historical heritage of the Rock River Valley, marking the first time the mansion was at the center of a public political debate. As the 1950s drew to a close, the mansion stood as a beautiful paradox, a perfectly preserved monument to the Gilded Age surrounded by the frantic energy of the space age. The air of Rockville was filled with the scent of freshly laid asphalt and the hum of new lawnmowers from the neighboring subdivisions, a constant reminder that the isolation of the estate was a thing of the past. The seventh part of our journey concludes with the family reaching a monumental decision to seek a permanent steward for the mansion, realizing that the only way to save the house was to give it away to the people. The limestone was still bright, and the grand staircase still swept upward with a grace that defied the passage of time, but the era of the Lyon family as the masters of Glenview was nearing its final curtain call. The story was moving toward a radical transformation that would see the private parlors turned into public galleries, and the secret gardens turned into a community sanctuary, ensuring that the legacy of the 19th century visionaries would survive the pressures of the 20th century reality. The stage was set for the 1960s, a decade of transition and rebirth that would redefine the meaning of the mansion for a new generation of Illinois residents. The windows of Glenview looked out over a landscape that was unrecognizable to the men who had laid the foundations in 1881. Yet the house itself remained a steadfast anchor of beauty and history in a world that was moving faster than anyone could have predicted. Every room was prepared for its next life, and every stone seemed to wait with a quiet dignity for the moment when the heavy iron gates would be opened to the world for the very last time as a private residence, and for the first time as a shared heritage. The 1960s arrived at the gates of Glenview Mansion as a decade of profound transformation, marking the official end of its life as a private residence and its rebirth as a public treasure. This eighth part of our 16-part exploration chronicles the delicate an often emotional handover of the estate from the Lyon family to the city of Rockville, a process that saw the grand limestone palace teeter on the edge of obsolescence before being reclaimed as a civic anchor. By 1961, the surrounding landscape had completed its transition from the rolling pastoral hills of the 19th century into a vibrant, dense tapestry of mid-century suburban life, leaving the mansion as a solitary island of Gilded Age memory amidst a sea of modern developments. The Lyon family, after years of private struggle to maintain the 5-story structure, reached a final historic agreement to donate the house and the remaining 60 acres of land to the municipality, ensuring that the architecture would be preserved and the grounds would become a permanent park for the people of Illinois. This period of transition was a logistical marathon. The 8th part of our story focuses on the massive inventory and cataloging process that took place within the walnut-paneled rooms, as decades of private possessions were moved to make way for public galleries. Longtime residents of Rockville still remember the sight of moving vans and archival teams working beneath the grand portico, a visual signal that the invisible wall between the elite and the community was finally coming down. The city's acquisition was not merely a real estate transaction, but a cultural revolution, as the local government had to suddenly pivot from traditional civic management to the complex world of museum curation and historic preservation. The initial opening of the mansion to the public in the mid-60s was a momentous event, with thousands of citizens lining up at the iron gates to finally see the interiors that had been whispered about for 80 years. Inside, the house felt like a ghost of itself, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and the silence that follows the departure of a large family. Yet the architecture itself, the soaring columns, the marble fireplaces, and the intricate plasterwork, remained as commanding as ever. The 8th part of our narrative also examines the early challenges of public stewardship, as the city struggled to balance the need for modern safety upgrades, such as fire suppression systems and reinforced flooring, with a mandate to keep the historic fabric of the 1900s intact. This decade saw the ballroom, once the site of exclusive jazz-age galas, transformed into a multi-purpose community space, hosting art shows, city council sessions, and educational workshops that breathed a different kind of life into the limestone walls. The gardens, too, underwent a functional shift. The private, hidden glens of the Lyon era were reimagined as public walking paths, and the reflection pool became a gathering place for local families. However, the 1960s were also a time of social upheaval, and Glenview found itself at the center of a changing cultural conversation regarding the legacy of the Gilded Age. Some viewed the mansion as an unnecessary relic of a stratified past, while others saw it as an essential piece of the region's soul that provided a sense of continuity in a world that was moving too fast. The city's commitment to the estate was tested by the economic fluctuations of the late 60s, requiring the formation of the first dedicated volunteer groups who would eventually become the backbone of the mansion's survival. These early preservationists spent their weekends weeding the rose gardens and polishing the brass fixtures, driven by the belief that the beauty of Glenview belonged to everyone. The 8th part of our journey concludes as the decade drew to a close, with the mansion having successfully survived its first years of public life. The air of Rockville was no longer defined by the exclusivity of the Lyon reign, but by the inclusive energy of a community that had adopted the mansion as its own. The limestone remained bright against the Illinois sky, and the grand staircase now welcomed the footsteps of school children and curious tourists rather than diplomats and industrial titans. The story of Glenview was moving away from the drama of a single family and into the collective memory of a city, a transition that secured its future even as it fundamentally altered its spirit. The stage was set for the 1970s, a decade that would bring a renewed focus on scientific restoration and the first major efforts to interpret the mansion's history for a modern, diverse audience. The windows of Glenview reflected a world that was finally able to look back at its own foundations with both pride and a critical eye, ensuring that the legacy of 1881 would never be lost to the shadows of the past. The arrival of the 1970s brought a new chapter of scholarly discovery and meticulous preservation to Glenview Mansion, as the city of Rockville began to transition from being a simple landlord of the property to a dedicated guardian of its historical soul. This ninth part of our 16-part exploration examines the decade when the mansion became a focal point for the blossoming American preservation movement, a period defined by the realization that simply keeping the doors open was not enough to honor the complexity of the estate's past. As the nation prepared for its bicentennial celebrations in 1976, a wave of nostalgia and civic pride swept across Illinois, prompting the local government to invest more heavily in the scientific restoration of the mansion's interior. The ninth part of our story focuses on the hidden work that defined this era, as teams of architectural historians began to peel back layers of mid-century paint and wallpaper to uncover the original decorative schemes of the Leon family. This was the decade of the great forensic audit of the house, where every floorboard, every plaster molding, and every brass fixture was catalogued with a level of detail that had been ignored during the more utilitarian years of the 1960s. Curators spent countless hours in the city archives, cross-referencing old photographs with surviving invoices to ensure that the restoration of the formal parlors and the grand dining room would reflect the exact aesthetic of 1910. This commitment to accuracy meant that the mansion was no longer just a community center. It was becoming a time capsule that allowed visitors to step out of the tumultuous world of the 70s and into the refined elegance of the pre-war era. However, the 1970s also presented significant physical challenges to the structure, as the massive limestone blocks began to show the first signs of serious environmental wear from decades of Midwestern freeze and thaw cycles. The ninth part of our narrative detail the high-stakes engineering projects that were undertaken to stabilize the grand portico and the soaring chimneys, requiring specialized stonemasons who were trained in the nearly lost arts of the 19th century. While the exterior was being reinforced, the interior was being transformed into a more educational space, with the introduction of the first professionalized tour guides who were trained to speak not just about the beauty of the architecture, but about the social and economic history of the Rock River Valley. This was the era when the stories of the people who worked behind the scenes, the cooks, the maids, and the groundskeepers, began to be integrated into the public narrative, providing a more balanced view of life at Glenview. The gardens, too, saw a return to their geometric roots. As the city's horticultural department utilized historic planting lists to reintroduce heritage roses and ornamental shrubs that had been lost during the leaner years of the war. Despite the economic stagnation that gripped much of the country during the mid-70s, the community's support for Glenview remained unshakable, with local civic groups raising funds for the restoration of the mansion's original stained glass windows and the acquisition of period-appropriate furniture. This period saw the mansion solidify its role as the cultural heart of Rockville, a place where history was not a static thing to be looked at through a velvet rope, but a living part of the town's daily life. The ninth part of our journey concludes as the decade drew to a close, with Glenview standing more beautiful and more understood than it had been in over 50 years. The air of the hilltop was filled with the sounds of community festivals and historical reenactments, and the limestone walls seemed to glow with a renewed sense of purpose. The city had proven that it could be a responsible steward of a Gilded Age masterpiece, and the mansion was prepared to enter the 1980s with its structural integrity secured and its story more fully told. The windows of the grand ballroom looked out over a Rockville that was continuing to grow, but the estate remained a protected sanctuary, a place where the values of craftsmanship and permanence were still honored. The stage was set for the next phase of the mansion's evolution, which would see it leverage the technological advancements of the late 20th century to preserve its legacy for a digital age. Every room now whispered with a clearer voice, telling the story of the dreamers who had built the house and the community that had fought to save it, ensuring that the light of Glenview would never be extinguished by the passage of time. The arrival of the 1980s ushered in a period of intense technological modernization and administrative refinement for Glenview Mansion, as the city of Rockville sought to harmonize the estate's historic charm with the increasingly rigorous demands of late 20th century facility management. This 10th part of our 16-part narrative explores the decade when the mansion transitioned from a well-loved local landmark into a state-of-the-art heritage site, a metamorphosis driven by the need to protect the delicate interior environment from the volatile Illinois climate. While the previous decades had focused on the visible aesthetics of the Leon family's reign, the 1980s were defined by what lay beneath the surface, specifically the installation of complex, non-invasive climate control systems and sophisticated fire suppression technology that could safeguard the invaluable walnut paneling and plasterwork without compromising the house's visual integrity. The 10th part of our story focuses on the logistical challenge of threading modern infrastructure through 18th century-style walls, a process that required engineers to work alongside historians to ensure that every vent, pipe, and sensor was hidden from public view. This era saw the basement of the mansion transformed into a high-tech nerve center, where computers monitored humidity and temperature in real time to prevent the expansion and contraction of the antique floorboards that had been a constant source of concern for curators. This period also marked a significant shift in the mansion's economic model, as the city established a more robust partnership with private foundations and the Friends of Glenview to fund the increasingly expensive specialized maintenance required by the limestone exterior. The 10th part of our narrative also examines the expansion of the mansion's social utility during the 80s, as it became a premier venue for corporate retreats, high-end weddings, and civic galas that generated the revenue necessary to keep the museum operations afloat. This commercial success was a double-edged sword, as the increased foot traffic necessitated a new round of structural reinforcements in the grand ballroom and the foyer to handle the weight of hundreds of guests and their modern equipment. Outside, the 1980s brought a renewed focus on the surrounding 60 acres of parkland, with the city commissioning a master plan that integrated the historic gardens with new, ecologically sensitive trail systems that highlighted the native flora of the Rock River Valley. This was the decade when the mansion's role as an environmental sanctuary became as important as its role as a historical one, providing a vital green lung for the ever-expanding suburbs of Rockville. The horticultural team utilized the advancements in botanical science to save several of the original oaks that had been planted by the Leon family in the 1880s, using deep root fertilization and lightning protection systems to ensure their survival into the next century. As the decade progressed, the mansion's educational reach expanded through the introduction of the first computerized archives, allowing local students and researchers to access the digitizing records of the estate's construction and the family's industrial legacy. The 10th chapter of our journey concludes as the 1980s drew to a close, with Glenview standing as a model of how a municipality could successfully manage a massive historic asset in a modern economy. The air of the hilltop was filled with the sounds of prosperity and progress, and the limestone walls remained as stoic and white as the day they were quarried, now backed by the invisible strength of 21st century technology. The city had proven that the mansion was not a burden, but an engine of civic identity and economic vitality, a place where the past provided a prestigious backdrop for the future. The stage was set for the 1990s, a decade that would see the mansion reach new heights of national recognition and face the challenges of a world that was becoming increasingly digital and interconnected. Every room in the house was now a carefully balanced ecosystem of history and technology, and the legacy of the Lyon family was being shared with a wider audience than they could have ever imagined. The story of Glenview was no longer a local secret. It was a celebrated piece of the American tapestry, a testament to the enduring power of architecture to anchor a community through a century of change. The windows reflected a city that had grown up around the estate, but the house itself remained a tranquil island of elegance, ready to sail into the final decade of the millennium, with its flag flying high and its foundations more secure than ever before. The arrival of the 1990s brought a new spirit of global awareness and cultural depth to Glenview Mansion, as the world began to shrink under the influence of the burgeoning information age. This 11th part of our 16-part narrative explores a decade of significant expansion for the estate, as the city of Rockville sought to elevate the mansion from a local civic landmark to a nationally recognized cultural destination. As the 90s progressed, the focus shifted from the internal stabilization of the 1980s to a more outward-facing mission that emphasized the complex social narratives woven into the very fabric of the limestone walls. The 11th part of our story focuses on the radical reimagining of the mansion's educational programs, which moved beyond the standard aesthetic tour of the past to include deep-dive explorations into the industrial history of the Midwest and the diverse lives of those who had built the Lyon fortune. This was the decade when the mansion's archives were first opened to a wider pool of academic researchers, leading to the discovery of hidden diaries and correspondence that shed new light on the family's role in the early development of Illinois infrastructure. These findings were integrated into a new, immersive visitor experience that utilized early digital audio guides, allowing the rooms to speak with a multitude of voices. While the history was being expanded, the physical maintenance of the estate required a more delicate touch. The 1990s saw the commencement of the Great Roof Restoration, a multi-year project that involved sourcing authentic slate from the same quarries used in the 19th century to ensure a perfect geological match. The 11th part of our narrative also details the emergence of the mansion as a hub for the burgeoning regional art scene, as the formal parlors and the glass-walled conservatory were utilized for rotating exhibitions of contemporary sculpture and photography that created a startling and beautiful contrast with the neoclassical architecture. This decade saw a significant increase in the mansion's visibility on the national stage, as it was featured in several architectural journals and heritage travel publications, drawing a new wave of cultural tourists to the Rock River Valley. The management of the 60-acre grounds also entered a more sophisticated phase during the 90s, with the introduction of integrated pest management and organic soil revitalization programs that prioritized the long-term health of the ecosystem over short-term aesthetic perfection. This period was marked by a deep sense of environmental stewardship, as the city recognized that the estate was one of the last remaining corridors for native wildlife in a county that was otherwise fully developed. The 11th chapter of our journey concludes as the mansion prepared to cross the threshold into the new millennium, standing as a polished and profound testament to the power of public preservation. The air of the hilltop was filled with the sounds of a community that was increasingly proud of its heritage, and the limestone walls seemed to absorb the optimism of the late 90s. The city had successfully transformed a private palace into a public classroom, a gallery, and a sanctuary, proving that the values of the Gilded Age could be adapted for a more inclusive and democratic era. The stage was set for the 2000s, a decade that would bring the challenges of the digital revolution and a renewed focus on the sustainable future of the estate in a changing world. Every room in the house was now a vessel for a much larger story than any one family could tell, and the legacy of Glenview was being prepared for a future where its physical beauty would be matched by its intellectual and social relevance. The windows of the mansion reflected a world that was moving toward a new century, but the house itself remained a steadfast anchor, a place of quiet dignity and enduring grace that continued to inspire all who walked through its grand limestone portico. The story of Glenview was no longer just about the past. It was about the way the past could inform and enrich the present, creating a bridge of memory that stretched across the decades to connect the visionaries of 1881 with the citizens of a new digital age. The transition into the year 2000 was marked not by the technological chaos many had feared, but by a profound sense of continuity at Glenview Mansion as the estate crossed the threshold into its third century of existence. This 12th part of our 16-part narrative explores the era of the digital awakening, a decade when the limestone palace in Rockville began to project its presence far beyond the borders of Illinois, utilizing the burgeoning power of the internet to share its meticulously preserved secrets with a global audience. As the new millennium dawned, the city of Rockville and the dedicated curators of the estate realized that the physical walls of the mansion were no longer the only way to experience its history. This was the decade of the Great Digitization Project, where thousands of fragile documents, architectural drawings from the 1880s, and rare photographs from the Leon family's private albums were scanned and uploaded to a central database. The 12th part of our story focuses on how this digital transparency transformed the mansion from a silent monument into a vibrant hub for genealogical and architectural research, attracting scholars from across the ocean who sought to understand the American interpretation of neoclassical design. Inside the house, the 2000s brought a new level of interactive museum technology, including the introduction of discrete touchscreen kiosks and enhanced audio tour that allowed visitors to dive deeper into the specific stories of the rooms, from the acoustics of the grand ballroom to the complex social hierarchy of the service wings. This period also saw a significant shift in the mansion's role as a civic sanctuary. As the world outside became increasingly fast-paced and digitally saturated, Glenview was reclaimed as a place of profound silence and slow reflection. The 12th part of our narrative also details the major structural challenges that emerged during this decade, specifically the aging of the massive foundation stones that had been set over 100 years prior. The city embarked on a high-stakes preservation project that utilized modern laser scanning technology to map every millimeter of the limestone facade, identifying microscopic cracks before they could threaten the integrity of the building. This was the era of surgical conservation, where restorers used specialized resins and historically accurate mortars to heal the stones of the mansion without leaving a trace of the intervention. Outside, the landscaping moved toward a philosophy of historic ecology, with the grounds team working to re-establish the specific microclimates that had allowed the Leon family to maintain their exotic conservatories in the early 20th century. This decade saw the restoration of the Hidden Glen, a secluded portion of the property that had become overgrown during the mid-century, which was reopened as a site for quiet contemplation and environmental education. The 12,000s also brought a renewed focus on the mansion's economic sustainability in a changing world. The city expanded its partnership with local businesses to host high-profile cultural festivals and outdoor symphony performances that drew tens of thousands of people to the grounds, cementing Glenview's status as the emotional and cultural heart of the region. As the decade progressed, the mansion became a symbol of resilience, surviving the economic fluctuations of the late 2000s through a combination of robust public funding and a passionate volunteer base that had grown to include the grandchildren of those who first fought to save the house in the 1960s. The 12th chapter of our journey concludes as the mansion prepared to celebrate the centennial of its most significant architectural completion, standing as a polished, high-tech fortress of history that was more accessible and more transparent than ever before. The air of the Rockville hilltop was filled with the hum of a new century, and the limestone walls seemed to glow with a renewed vitality, reflecting a community that was no longer just looking back at the Gilded Age with nostalgia, but was using the lessons of the past to build a more cultured and connected future. The stage was set for the 2010s, a decade that would bring even more radical shifts in how we interpret the American story, and how we protect our most precious architectural treasures in an era of environmental uncertainty. Every room in the mansion was now a bridge between the physical and the digital, and the legacy of Glenview was being rewritten by a generation that valued the authenticity of stone as much as the speed of light. The windows of the grand foyer looked out over a landscape that was now fully modern, yet the house itself remained a sanctuary of permanence, a place where the clocks seemed to tick with a slower, more deliberate rhythm, reminding everyone that while the world may change, the power of a great house to anchor a community is eternal. The arrival of the 2010s brought a sharpening of the social and environmental consciousness surrounding Glenview Mansion, as the estate entered a decade of profound introspection and structural refinement. This 13th part of our 16-part exploration examines the era when the limestone palace in Rockville became a focal point for the modern dialogue on sustainability and inclusive historical interpretation, ensuring that the legacy of the 19th century founders was balanced with the needs of a 21st century community. As the decade unfolded, the management of the estate recognized that the mansion could no longer exist as a static monument to the Gilded Age, but had to become an active participant in the town's ecological and cultural future. The 13th part of our story focuses on the radical greening of Glenview, a period that saw the installation of advanced geothermal heating and cooling systems that utilized the natural temperature of the Illinois earth to regulate the massive interior rooms without the need for the fossil fuels that had once powered the Lyon Empire. This technological leap was mirrored by a significant shift in the way the history of the house was presented to the public. The curators launched the Unseen Glenview initiative, which sought to highlight the stories of the diverse workforce that had kept the estate running during its first century. This research revealed the hidden lives of immigrant stonemasons, domestic workers, and seasonal farmhands, whose labor had been essential to the mansion's survival, but whose names had previously been absent from the official tour. By integrating these narratives into the digital archives and the physical galleries, the mansion transformed from a story of a single family into a mosaic of American striving. The physical structure of the house also required a new level of specialized care during the 2010s, as the city of Rockville faced increasingly intense weather patterns that put a unique strain on the porous limestone facade. The 13th part of our narrative details the multi-year effort to implement a holistic moisture management system, using non-invasive sensors to track water infiltration behind the original masonry, and applying cutting-edge vapor-permeable sealants that protected the stone while allowing it to breathe. This was the decade of precision preservation, where the interventions were invisible to the naked eye but essential for the building's longevity. Outside, the 60-acre grounds became a laboratory for urban rewilding and native species restoration. The formal terraces were maintained as a nod to the Lyon aesthetic, but the peripheral meadows were allowed to return to their natural prairie state, providing a vital habitat for pollinator species and migrating birds. This environmental shift turned the mansion into a premier center for local ecological education, with school groups arriving daily to study the intersection of human architecture and the natural world. The 2010s also saw a surge in the mansion's role as a sanctuary for the arts, with the establishment of a year-round artist-in-residence program that invited contemporary creators to live and work on the grounds, using the history of the estate as inspiration for modern film, music, and sculpture. This cultural vibrancy ensured that Glenview remained relevant to a younger, more diverse generation of Rockville residents who saw the mansion not as a relic of the past, but as a living platform for the future. As the decade progressed, the estate's economic model became a study in public-private partnership, as the city leveraged the mansion's prestige to attract national grants and private endowments that funded the continued digitization of the Lyon, extensive correspondence and business records. The 13th chapter of our journey concludes as the mansion stood at the threshold of the 2020s, a decade that would bring unprecedented global challenges and further test the resilience of the community. The air of the hilltop was filled with the scent of native wildflowers and the quiet hum of energy-efficient systems, and the limestone walls remained as steadfast as ever, reflecting a world that was learning how to value the permanence of history in an age of rapid change. The city had proven that Glenview was a flexible and enduring asset, a place where the grandeur of 1881 could coexist with the ethics of the modern era. The stage was set for the final chapters of our story, where we will look at how the mansion navigated the most recent years of global upheaval and how it prepares to face the future as a symbol of American persistence. Every room in the house was now a testament to the power of adaptation, and the legacy of Glenview was being nurtured by a community that understood that to save a house, one must also save the stories of everyone who ever called it home. The windows of the Grand Conservatory looked out over a landscape that was both ancient and new, and the house itself remained a beacon of light and history, ready to weather whatever storms the coming years might bring. The arrival of the 2020s brought an unprecedented era of quietude and subsequent rebirth to Glenview Mansion, as the global events of 2020 forced a temporary closure of its heavy iron gates and a reimagining of its role in a socially distanced world. This 14th part of our 16-part narrative examines how the estate transitioned from a high-traffic event venue into a pioneering digital sanctuary, proving that the limestone walls of Rockville were capable of sheltering the community's spirit even when the physical doors were locked. During the early years of the decade, the silence that fell over the mansion was reminiscent of the 1930s. Yet this time it was accompanied by a massive surge in virtual connectivity that allowed the Glenview experience to reach more people than ever before. The 14th part of our story focuses on the Windows into History initiative, a high-definition streaming project that used remote-controlled cameras to lead virtual tour through the restricted areas of the attic and the service basements, areas that had never been open to the public due to safety regulations. This digital expansion was supported by the most significant archival undertaking in the estate's history, as a team of remote historians worked to transcribe thousands of pages of Lyon family ledgers and personal letters, creating a searchable online library that transformed the mansion into a global center for Gilded Age research. As the world slowly began to reopen, the mansion's 60-acre parkland became an essential outdoor refuge for the residents of Rockville, with the city implementing a garden-first strategy that prioritized the restorative power of the landscape. The 14th part of our narrative details the construction of the new sensory garden and the expansion of the woodland trails, which were designed to be fully accessible to visitors of all physical abilities, ensuring that the beauty of the Rock River Valley was a truly democratic resource. This period also saw a major architectural milestone with the completion of the Great Portico Stabilization, a project that used carbon fiber reinforcement and laser-guided masonry alignment to secure the massive ionic columns for another century without altering their historic profile. This surgical engineering was a testament to the city's commitment to the highest standards of preservation, treating every stone as a precious artifact. Inside the house, the 2020s brought a more nuanced approach to interior curation. Rather than focusing solely on the peak wealth of 1910, the rooms were adjusted to reflect the various layers of history we have explored in this series, from the utilitarian war effort rooms of the 40s to the preservation offices of the 70s. This living timeline approach allowed visitors to see the mansion not as a static museum, but as a resilient entity that had evolved alongside the nation. The 14th chapter of our journey concludes as the mansion celebrated its 140th anniversary, the first foundation stone being laid, standing as a beacon of stability in an era of rapid global change. The air of the Rockville hilltop was filled with a sense of profound gratitude, and the limestone walls seemed to glow with a renewed light, reflecting a community that had rediscovered the importance of its local landmarks during a time of crisis. The city had successfully navigated the transition into a post-pandemic world, proving that Glenview was not just a relic of the past, but a vital, breathing component of the future's social and ecological infrastructure. Every room in the house was now a node in a global network of history, and the legacy of the Leon family was being protected by a generation of professionals and volunteers who understood that true preservation is a constant, active dialogue between the generations. The windows of the grand ballroom looked out over a Rockville that was more connected and more conscious of its history than ever before, and the house itself remained a steadfast anchor of beauty, ready to face the final chapters of its storied existence with grace and an unwavering commitment to the public good. Moving toward the midpoint of the 2020s, Glenview Mansion has transitioned into a period of profound cultural synthesis, where the weight of its long history is being used as a foundation for a radical new vision of community engagement and educational innovation. This 15th part of our 16-part saga explores the mansion in its current state of peak vitality, operating not merely as a museum of the past, but as a vibrant incubator for the future of Rockville. The narrative of this decade is defined by the Glenview 360 initiative, an ambitious program that has completely overhauled the visitor experience to make it one of the most immersive and inclusive in the country. This era has seen the integration of augmented reality into the physical tour, where visitors can use handheld devices to see the rooms as they appeared in different decades, watching the transition from the gaslight of the 1880s to the electric buzz of the 1920s right before their eyes. The 15th part of our story focuses on the mansion's role as a leader in regenerative preservation, a philosophy that seeks to not only maintain the building, but to actively improve the surrounding social and ecological environment. The limestone walls, now expertly cleaned and reinforced, serve as the backdrop for a series of high-level climate summits and community forums, proving that a Gilded Age estate can be a modern catalyst for solving the challenges of the present. On the grounds, the commitment to the environment has reached its zenith with the completion of the Rock River Restoration Project, which has successfully reintroduced several endangered local plant species to the mansion's glens, creating a biological corridor that connects the estate to the larger Illinois River system. Inside the mansion, the curation has become even more sophisticated, with the permanent staff working alongside guest curators from diverse backgrounds to tell the stories of Glenview through the lenses of labor, architecture, gender, and economics. This period has seen the unveiling of the Leon Community Archive, a massive digital and physical collection that invites local families to contribute their own artifacts and oral histories related to the estate, effectively turning the mansion into a collective memory bank for all of Rockville. The physical health of the building remains a top priority, and this decade has seen the implementation of a revolutionary self-healing mortar system that uses biological agents to repair microscopic cracks in the masonry, a technological marvel that would have seemed like science fiction to the original stonemasons. The 15th chapter also details the mansion's emergence as a premier center for the slow history movement, encouraging visitors to spend entire days on the property, engaging in traditional crafts, historical gardening, or simply finding a quiet corner of the library to read. This shift away from quick, transactional tourism has fostered a deep, emotional connection between the residents of the region and the white stone palace on the hill, ensuring that the mansion is viewed as a vital public utility rather than an elitist relic. As the year 2025 passes, the mansion stands as a shining example of how a historic site can be both a sanctuary of the past and a powerhouse of the future. The air of the hilltop is filled with the sounds of a community that has fully embraced its heritage, and the limestone walls seem to reflect a wisdom earned over nearly a century and a half of survival. The city of Rockville has proven that through careful stewardship, technological innovation, and a commitment to honest storytelling, a house can become a soul. The 15th part of our journey concludes as we prepare to enter the final chapter of our series, where we will look toward the ultimate legacy of Glenview and its enduring role as a symbol of American persistence in an ever-changing world. The conversation between the land, the architecture, and the people has reached its most harmonious phase yet, and the mansion stands ready to lead the way into the next 100 years with its doors wide open and its light burning brighter than ever before. Every stone tells a story, every garden path holds a memory, and every window looks out toward a future that is as grand and promising as the very first dream of 1881. As we reach the 16th and final chapter of our journey through the life of Glenview Mansion, we find ourselves standing at the precipice of a new era, looking back across the long, winding road that began in the dust of 1881 and led to the polished limestone sanctuary of the 2020s. The story of Glenview is ultimately a testament to the enduring power of place and the remarkable resilience of a structure that was built for the few, but eventually claimed by the many. This concluding part of our series reflects on the mansion not just as a physical landmark of Rockville, Illinois, but as a living bridge between the industrial foundations of the American past and the ecological aspirations of its future. The mansion today stands as a masterclass in the art of survival, having navigated the peaks of Gilded Age excess, the lean anxieties of the Great Depression, the frantic mobilization of 2 world wars, and the radical social shifts of the suburban age. To walk through the halls now is to feel the weight of a century and a half of human experience, where the original neoclassical vision of the Leon family has been enriched by the contributions of thousands of gardeners, stonemasons, curators, and citizens who refused to let this piece of history fade into the shadows. This final era is defined by a sense of permanent stewardship. The mansion is no longer a fragile relic under constant threat, but a robust civic engine that provides a sense of identity and continuity to a world that often feels fragmented. The 16th part of our story focuses on the ultimate legacy of the estate as a model for the living heritage movement, where the lessons of the past are actively used to inform modern urban planning, environmental conservation, and social equity. The 60-acre parkland, once a private hunting ground, has become a vital commons where the boundaries between nature and culture are blurred, proving that the preservation of a great house is inseparable from the preservation of the land it sits upon. The limestone facade, having been reinforced by the most advanced technology of the 21st century, glows with a warmth that seems to defy the passage of time, serving as a constant reminder that craftsmanship and beauty are essential components of a healthy society. Inside, the Glenview Legacy Project has reached its culmination, with every room serving as a portal into a different chapter of the American story, ensuring that the voices of the overlooked are heard just as clearly as the voices of the elite. This final chapter also looks toward the next century, envisioning a Glenview that continues to adapt to the changing climate and the evolving needs of the people of Rockville, perhaps utilizing new forms of clean energy and digital storytelling that we can currently only imagine. The mansion has become a sanctuary for the long view, a place where the community can gather to think about the generations that came before and the generations that are yet to arrive. As the sun sets over the Rock River Valley, casting its final, golden rays across the grand portico and the sweeping terraces, the spirit of the house feels more vibrant than ever. The silence of the night is no longer a sign of neglect, but a peaceful pause in a story that is still being written by everyone who visits, everyone who volunteers, and everyone who stops to admire the white stone sentinel on the hill. The story of Glenview Mansion is a narrative of iron, earth, and limestone. But more than that, it is a story of human persistence and the collective will to hold on to the things that matter. We conclude our 16-part saga with the mansion standing tall, its foundations deep in the Illinois soil, and its windows reflecting the infinite possibilities of a future built on the wisdom of the past. The legacy of 1881 is secure, the gates are open, and the light of Glenview continues to shine as a beacon of history, beauty, and hope for all who seek it.